Okay, now before proceeding into battle, let's talk about one special rule, and this is the so-called special reaction. As we mentioned, the Japanese player playing their card is the offensive player, and so they are deciding which moves to do and possibly which battles to declare. Suppose the Japanese conduct an amphibious assault here and also declare a battle here. This can be done even with the use of an OC card, because practically they have only declared the battle hex here, which is Tenryu fighting Lexington, and this one was unoccupied, so no battle is normally going to occur. So they can do this kind of amphibious assault in order to take control of Ulithi if it was Allied controlled, without needing to declare a battle hex. And after that, the reaction player can possibly react to the battle hexes by sending some reinforcements to defend, and that's the only kind of reaction move they can do, to fight in battle hexes. However, when an amphibious assault is made and this hex is an important location, which means it contains a port or airfield or resource or named location like a town, then if this hex is within the zone of influence of the controller's unit and within range of an in-supply headquarters, the reaction player may attempt to create another battle hex in this situation. So, for example, the Japanese are moving into Ulithi, and this is in range of the Central Pacific headquarters from Oahu, and it is within the zone of influence of Lexington. So in this case, the amphibious landing will be contested, because the airplanes of Lexington have spotted the invaders and they are mounting their counterattack. And in this case, it doesn't matter whether this zone of influence is neutralized or not. Now, in this case, they can attempt to create another additional battle hex for this amphibious assault, and this is called special reaction. And for as many amphibious assaults made this way, they have to attempt to create these hexes by rolling the die. Which means the opposite is also true. If the hex is not an important location, namely an airfield or port or a resource or a city, you can amphibious assault it, and a special reaction cannot be made here. Which means if the Americans, for example, want to retake Philippines, it might be a good idea to amphibiously assault here in this nameless hex and later push forward instead of having to amphibiously assault Davao, for example. So this is a safe choice. But before talking about how the die roll impacts the creation of this battle hex, let's clarify the rules about reaction. Upon the offensive player concludes his moves and possibly declares his battle hexes and declares which units participate in which battle, then there are three cases. The offensive might either be a surprise attack or an intercept or an ambush. So, suppose the card played was Tokyo Express, this event. There are two values on the top of the card. These are the values to determine whether the attack is surprise attack or not. Therefore, if the Americans will be able to spot the landings and movement or will be caught by surprise. The reaction player can do two things. Either play a reaction card, which are the blue ones, or roll the die to determine the intelligence condition. So, in this case, if the Japanese have played Tokyo Express as an OC card, the value is 5. So if the Allies roll a 5 or less, they can intercept the offensive and thus defend themselves. If they roll higher than that, then it is a surprise attack. They cannot move in reaction and the Japanese will complete their movement without hindrance. If the card was played as an EC, thus as an event, then the intelligence value would be higher. So 7 or less would be sufficient for the Allies to achieve intercept. This is the main procedure for altering the intelligence condition, and there are also some painful ambush events for the American player, which means that they have kind of broken the Japanese communication codes and they have been well prepared in advance and they are ambushing the Japanese and attacking them before they can set themselves up. So before proceeding to battle, mainly surprise attack means that the attacker fires first and then the defender responds by firing back with what is remaining of his forces. Intercept means that the offensive was spotted and the reaction player moves and both players fire simultaneously. And ambush means that the reaction player ambushes the offensive player and fires first before the offensive player has the chance to fire. But let's focus more on the intelligence condition. As you may notice, most cards have a higher intelligence condition if they are played as an EC than if played as an OC. And also, you may notice that cards of smaller OC value have lower intelligence values. This practically means that smaller operations are more sneaky and harder to detect by the reacting player, while big, loud offensives are easier to detect for the reaction player. So if the Japanese are mounting a whole Tokyo Express operation and thus mobilizing a whole number of naval and air and ground units, the American intelligence is more likely to detect this operation and react to it. There is one and only one modifier for this die roll, and this is if during the offensive any offensive player's unit moved into or out of a reaction player's zone of influence, then there's a -2 modifier on the dice. So, for example, in this case, Tenryu has moved into the zone of influence of Lexington. So in this case, not only a 7 will suffice if the card was played as an event, but also an 8 or possibly a 9 would be the case, but this is an exception to the rules. A 9 is always a fail. So even if there is a -2 modifier for the intelligence, if the allies roll a 9, it is always a fail intelligence, and this will be a surprise attack in favor of the Japanese. And in this case, again, it doesn't matter whether the zone of influence is neutralized or not. Therefore, summing up, the zone of influence, even if it is neutralized, can detect enemy offensives and provide the -2 modifier in the die roll. And also, this is the same number that you have to roll in order to create additional battle hexes for enemy amphibious assault when they are in range of your zone of influence in unoccupied hexes. So once more, if the Japanese try to conquer an important hex like this one, Yap, by an amphibious assault, even if it is unoccupied, which otherwise would mean that the amphibious assault would be a free capture, because it is within the Allied zone of influence and in range of a in-supply Allied headquarters, the Allies can roll for special reaction in order to create an additional battle hex in the hex of the amphibious assault. And the die roll range is the same as the one that would be made for the intelligence roll. However, when rolling for intelligence to possibly achieve an intercept, you can either roll the die or decide to play a reaction card which changes the intelligence condition to possibly intercept or ambush. You cannot do both. If you roll the die and the die roll is not favorable to you, then you cannot play the intelligence card to achieve intercept. Also, there is a particular sequence during the offensive. You first have to attempt to create the special reaction hexes, and in this case you cannot play a card, you just have to roll the die, and after checking whether you achieved to create the additional battle hexes, then you can either play a card to achieve intercept or ambush, or you can decide to roll the die to achieve it. However, there are some certain cards, like this one, which specifies that the intelligence condition is surprise attack. So in this case, you cannot roll the die to change the intelligence condition from surprise attack. It is stated by this icon and in the text as well. The only thing you can do to change the intelligence condition is to play an intelligence reaction card to make it an intercept or an ambush possibly. However, as I mentioned previously, for special reaction, you cannot play a card. You have to roll the die. So, as you may notice, this card only has intelligence values for an OC offensive, not for an EC offensive, of course, because if you play it as a surprise attack, the opponent cannot roll the die, only if you play it as an OC. So for special reaction and only for special reaction, you consult this number, the OC number, to roll and see if you manage to create the additional battle hexes. So in this case, assume the allies try to do an amphibious assault. In order to create an additional battle hex for this unoccupied hex, the Japanese have to roll the die using this number, the OC value of 3. And if they succeed, they can try to change the intelligence condition only by using an appropriate reaction card. And returning to Amphibious Assault, if the reaction player manages to react and bring a naval unit into the Amphibious Assault hex, and the Amphibious Assault unit is against a naval unit without a naval unit of its own in the hex, then the Amphibious Assault automatically fails and the unit has to leave. And also it loses one step. When I say leave, I mean it conducts post-battle movement like a naval unit. Anytime an Amphibious Assault is unsuccessful, which means the battle has not been won, the Amphibious Assault unit can conduct post-battle movement like a naval unit with its normal movement allowance. And in this case, it can move through the unneutralized ZOI until leaving it. What I mean is, suppose the Japanese again conducted an Amphibious Assault here in Yap, and Shokaku was eliminated, for example, and the Amphibious Assault failed. In this case, the Amphibious Assaulting ground unit has to conduct post-battle movement like a naval unit. It is within unneutralized ZOI, that's true, but it can move through the ZOI until leaving it. And then for the rest of its post-battle movement, it cannot re-enter the unneutralized ZOI, and it conducts post-battle movement normally, which is with the same movement allowance a naval unit would have, which is the OC value of the card times 5, until reaching a final destination, which is a friendly port. This is not the case for overland moving units. They cannot conduct post-battle movement like naval or air units. Also, notice some particularly tricky rule. As mentioned, if we declare an attack here and move our Tenryu to participate in this battle, then we have entered the American player's zone of influence. So he has a -2 modifier for his intelligence die roll. However, if we just activate this unit to fire from range towards the Lexington, then we practically have not moved into his ZOI. We have not crossed the hex side of his zone of influence, so we are not triggering the modifier. The die roll range is 7 again, and thus an 8 will be insufficient for the American player. So, summing up, there are 4 things that an unneutralized ZOI can do. So these 2 units have an unneutralized ZOI because they can trace supply, so they both have zone of influence. And in this case, it means 4 things. This one is out of supply because no supply line can trace through C-hex sides when there is an unneutralized ZOI. Same for line of activation, so this one, for example, cannot activate this one because there is the neutralized ZOI here, so there is no line of activation either. Third one is that a ground unit conducting Amphibious Assault cannot pass through an unneutralized ZOI through its water hex side, And the fourth one is that there can't be any strategic movement between these unneutralized zone of influence hexes. So for example, if either Hiei or Zuiho wants to conduct strategic movement, it cannot pass through here or here, for example. Furthermore, even if the zone of influence is neutralized, for example by this Japanese carrier, it still does 2 things. The first one is that if you enter or exit a zone of influence during your movement, during the offensive, then the reaction player will have a -2 die roll modifier when determining his intelligence condition, so from surprise attack to intercept. So even if this zone of influence is neutralized, he will have the -2, which increases his chance of detecting the enemy and reacting. And the second one is that for the creation of special reaction battle hexes, which is this one, the Japanese are trying to conduct an amphibious assault and it is inside the zone of influence of this air force. Again, you get the -2 die roll modifier for possibly rolling and creating an extra battle hex to stop this amphibious assault from happening. Now let's talk about the reaction move more in detail. If the reaction player achieved intercept or ambush by either playing a card or rolling the die successfully, and after possibly having created some additional battle hexes because of the amphibious assault, they can move units in reaction to the offensive. To do this, they have to activate an in-supply headquarters that is in range of at least one battle hexes. So in this case, we can point again at the Central Pacific headquarters from Oahu, which is in range of this battle, or this battle possibly, if it has been declared. So Central Pacific, as a headquarters, can activate eligible units in reaction. Since it's an American headquarters, it can activate American units. In order for the reaction player to actually react, there has to be an in-supply headquarters in range of at least one battle hex. So if the Americans declare battle onto this hex, then this headquarters cannot react because it is out of range of this hex. Because if you look closely, this is the 34 column and this is the 47 column, and the South Seas has got a range of 12. But if the Americans declare battle here, for example, this is within range of the South Seas headquarters, and upon establishing the fact that it is within range of a battle hex, it can react to any declared battle hexes, for example by sending one unit here and one unit here to fight against the Lexington in this hex, despite the fact that this battle hex itself is out of the range of the activating headquarters. However, they cannot move units wherever they want. The reaction move has to be so that the units participate in battles. So in this case, we've got a battle here, possibly declared by the Japanese player, and this special reaction battle, which is because the Japanese conducted the amphibious assault, and the American player managed to create the additional battle hex. So, Mr. Nimitz, as the Central Pacific headquarters, can activate this unit to come and help this naval battle, or to come deter the amphibious assault. Also, they can activate the air units, but notice that, as we mentioned, air units cannot enter the battle hex. But if they were in the battle hex at the beginning of the reaction move, they are not obliged to leave the hex. They just participate from where they are. But since they are here, and there is no legal hex to reach the battle from their normal range, they have to participate with their extended range, which means, spoiler alert, that their attack strength will be halved for this battle. As for how many units the reaction player can activate, the so-called defender's logistics value is always equal to the OC value of the card played by the offensive's player, whether the offensive player played the card as an event or as an OC offensive. So if, for example, the Japanese played a military event of a 3 OC value as an event card, the Allies will still be able to react with 3 units, which is the Japanese OC value of the card, plus any efficiency of their headquarters. Now, they can also move and use only one amphibious shipping point in order to move ground units in reaction. So, for example, they can move this guy here from any VTOC, and he can move with the normal movement allowance that would be allowed for this offensive. So if the card was a 2-value one, for example, this can go 10 hexes away. 1, 2, 3, 4, or even 4, it's no problem. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I mean, during naval movement, the presence of enemy units does not impede your movement, unless it is naval. And reach here. So we spent one amphibious shipping point as the Americans, because this is only one step, so it requires the expenditure of only one amphibious shipping point as a corps, and it can land here in Yap in order to deter the amphibious landing. However, the restrictions are again the same, which means if the Japanese had brought along a naval unit to cover this invasion, then this one unit would not be able to land without being stacked for the entire duration of its movement with a naval unit. And also, of course, it cannot pass through unneutralized ZOI, which is the case for this hex. It would have to take the long route here and covered by the ZOI of Lexington from here onwards. Reaction air units can, as earlier mentioned, pass through friendly controlled airfields that contain enemy units. So, for example, if the Japanese have attempted to conduct an amphibious assault here in an enemy VTOC that is Allied controlled, then in reaction, this air unit would be able to cross this hex and then continue its movement, but would not be able to finish its movement in the hex. So once more, the offensive sequence is the following. A player plays a card either as an OC card or an EC card, moves possibly their units, declares their battle hexes, and which units participate in which battle. Also, if an air unit is not assigned to a battle, which might be this case for example, if this unit moved here but has not been declared to participate in a battle, then after the creation of the battle hexes, it can be assigned to cover the landing here and thus lend its strength to the amphibious assault operation. Anyway, after declaring the battle hexes, there are some special cards called weather cards which cancel the whole offensive and actually the card as a whole, so any possible bonuses that might be gained from the card are forfeited and the card goes to the discard pile, even if it was one of these cards that indicates that should be removed from play if played as an event. In this case, it goes to the discard pile if cancelled by a weather card. And in this case, the amphibious shipping point expended are returned to the offensive's player. And then the intelligence player possibly creates the additional battle hexes for the contested amphibious assaults. After that, the reaction player either changes the intelligence condition by using an appropriate intelligence card or rolls the die, and if they are successful and achieve an intercept or an ambush, move their unit in reaction. If it is a surprise attack, they don't move their units and battles are conducted as they are. And prior to resolving the battles, the reaction player can play a number of attack reaction cards, which might be submarines or kamikaze or skip bombing, which is a maximum of 3 reaction cards during a whole offensive. So let's talk a bit more about the kinds of reaction cards. First of all, there are the intelligence condition reaction cards, which change the intelligence condition from surprise attack to intercept or ambush for the Americans sometimes, and you don't have to roll a die for that. And besides those, there are the so-called counter-offensive cards. The difference is that besides the card changing the intelligence condition to intercept, it's got its own logistics value, with or without some other bonuses or maluses, like in the case of Japanese counterattack at Savo Island, for example. So, if you just play a card to change the intelligence condition, then you react with your normal logistics value, which is the OC value of the offensive player's card played, plus the efficiency rating of your reacting headquarters. But when you're playing a counter-offensive, it has its own logistics value. So again, in the case of Savo Island, it would be 3 for the Japanese, plus any efficiency rating of their headquarters. Then there's a bunch of other reaction cards. We have already talked about the weather, which cancels the whole offensive for the Americans. And there's also some submarine attack cards, which are not related to the intelligence condition. Whatever the intelligence condition is, you can play the submarine attack cards. And the purpose of it is to inflict damage to enemy naval units. There's also the kamikaze attacks for the Japanese, which take place when the battle is close to Japan, and practically you sacrifice one Air Force unit in order to deal massive damage to the enemy navy. There's also the skip bombing attacks for the Allies, which may damage Japanese units and lose amphibious shipping points for the Japanese. And finally, there are some special cards, like this one, Mahatma Gandhi, which has got some special rules about it, and it is mainly related to the CBI theater in India. So if SEAC
is the activating headquarters, then you can use the Gandhi reaction to cancel the whole activation of the SIAC headquarters, and all units return to their starting positions, and also one Indian Corps is reduced by one step. Also, some cards have a draw a card effect when you play them, so each player can draw a number of cards during his reaction. So it is a maximum of 3 cards per player, and we use these markers for this purpose. If you have drawn 3 cards this turn, then you cannot draw anymore. You can play the cards normally, but you can't draw any more cards than 3.
And after that, players resolve all battles and possibly apply some bonuses or procedures that might happen at the conclusion of battles per the card's text. And after that, there is a post-battle movement conducted by units that have been activated and are eligible for post-battle movement. So in this case, if the American player had activated this unit, it can conduct post-battle movement, but if they did not activate this unit, although it possibly participated in the battle, it is not eligible for post-battle movement. It will stay where it is.
The movement allowance for post-battle movement is the same as during the rest of the offensive. So for example, if we had played a 2 OC value card, then for naval units, for example, it would be again 2 times 5 for a total of 10. Of course, I'm not talking about units that have conducted strategic movement during the offensive. For example, if Enterprise had moved strategically for 20 or 30 hexes, then it cannot conduct post-battle movement. But the rest of the units can do so with the normal movement allowance. The reaction player conducts his post-battle movement first, and then it is the offensive's player. And for the reaction player in particular, units have to end up in supply if possible. So if it was a Japanese player conducting the offensive and the American player reacting, and say this one was activated for the offensive and then he's conducting post-battle movement, please don't place it here, because this will not be in supply because of the presence of the unneutralized Japanese zone of influence, because it is a long-range bomber. That's only for the reaction player. This restriction does not apply to the offensive player.
And we conclude the offensive by conducting all necessary emergency naval movement and emergency air movement. So what does this mean? If after the completion of air, naval or ground battles, which we're going to talk about shortly, an air unit or a naval unit or a headquarters is located in an enemy-controlled hex, which means if somehow this ground unit gained control of this island and there is no Japanese ground unit here, then all these have to conduct emergency naval or air movement in order to leave the hex. Now, where can they go? An air unit has to move to any hex within its normal or extended range, which in this case would be 5 hexes away. And notice that in this case, it is placed, not moved. So even if the move would be illegal, you just place it, it's no problem. A naval unit has to be emergency moved up to 10 hexes away, regardless of its range. And a headquarters is removed from play and goes to the game turn track to later re-enter game upon the next turn as reinforcement. However, there are some particular headquarters that have a yellow dot upon them, which means these ones are removed from play upon being forced to emergency move. So the Malaya headquarters will leave play upon its hex changing control to the Japanese. Also, it is worth noting that upon the unit being activated and in supply, it remains in supply for the rest of the offensive. So, for example, even if it reaches far beyond the HQ's range, it will remain in supply, and thus it will be able to conduct post-battle movement until the conclusion of the offensive. This will not be an issue. There is also a restriction regarding unit stacking at the conclusion of the offensive, which is after all possible battles and post-battle movement, there cannot be more than 3 ground or air units in the same hex. So for example, if you have 2 ground units and 1 air unit and you want to bring some more ground unit during the offensive, you have to conduct some kind of post-battle movement out of the hex. Otherwise, these overstacked units, which is more than 3 ground or air units, will have to be dealt with, and to do so, you have to remove one of the overstacked units until you reach the stacking limit again. These units are eliminated if they are out of supply, but if they are in supply, they go to the turn track, and as we saw previously, they can return to the game as reinforcements. So in some cases, it might even be a smart move to overstack your units in order to voluntarily move your unit to the game track and possibly place it as reinforcements at a more useful point for the next turn.
Exception. This one unit, as we have mentioned previously, has the yellow dot on its upper right corner, which means it's a pre-war unit and it cannot receive a replacement. And also in this case, if we remove it from the map to the turn track, it will not re-enter the game as reinforcements. If for any reason it exits the map, it is eliminated.
Notice that some units have the same unit identity, particularly these are the Americans' long-range bomber and their kind of parent unit, Air Force unit. So for example, this is the 7th Air Force and this is the 7th Air Force long-range bomber. This means that if these units are placed together in the same hex, they count as one unit for purposes of stacking. So I remind you that you can only stack a total of 3 ground or air units in one hex at the end of an offensive, so after post-battle movement. So for example, in this case, this is an exception. You can place all these 4 units because these air units are considered as one for purposes of stacking. And it is worth noting that during the reinforcement and replacement segment, you cannot voluntarily violate the stacking as you can do during an offensive, which might result in a unit being repositioned into the turn track if it violates the stacking. And if this is a tough rule to remember, I will tell you a nice little story. I was playing the South Pacific scenario with a friend, and I noticed that 4 units were placed in the same hex during the setup proposed by the scenario rules themselves. And I was wondering what exactly was going on. And I posted this question online, and Mr. Mark Herman himself, as well as some other kind guys, replied to me that this is because these count as one unit and so there was no stacking violation. And that was a nice way of reminding myself of that rule. And the last thing worth noting is that there is a stacking limit for the naval units as well, which is no more than 6 naval units at each hex at the conclusion of the offensive after post-battle movement. So if you stack more than 6 naval units in one hex, then you have to remove the excessive ones to the game track if they are in supply, or to have them eliminated if they are not in supply.
When the air and ground unit stacking is violated, so when the air and ground units are more than 3 in the same hex, then you have to remove one, and the air units have to be removed first. And if there have to be additional units removed, then it can be ground units. And if it was air units, they are placed one turn later on the game track to later arrive as reinforcements. But if they are ground units, they are placed 2 turns later. And during naval unit stacking violation, if the units in the hex exceed 6, then the overstacked units removed, the naval ones, will be placed 1 turn later as well. And there's a stacking limit for the headquarters as well. Headquarters themselves do not count towards the stacking limit, like air or ground or naval units, but they have a stacking limit for themselves, which is no more than 1 headquarters per hex. So if you want to combine, say, an American headquarters with a joint headquarters, you cannot do so in the same hex. You have to find another one.